The war in Ukraine is cruel, but for many experts, it is not the last nightmare we will see in Europe. The prospect of an open conflict involving the three main powers on the planet, namely Russia, China, and the United States, may sound like an apocalyptic fantasy. However, for many, such a confrontation is more possible than you think. The invasion of Ukraine has reconfigured the geopolitical map, forging new alliances with the aim of dominating the world of tomorrow. In this scenario, Putin and Xi Jinping are determined to do everything to challenge Washington for hegemony. The question is, what would happen if a bloody conflict breaks out between the superpowers? In this new video from Military Force, we propose to analyze how such a disaster could unfold and the consequences it would leave behind. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Vladimir Zelensky's country has become the main recipient of U.S. military assistance. This is significant, since no European nation has occupied this strange, privileged position for decades, and the reasons are quite easy to understand. For Washington, the Russian invasion is a fierce demonstration of power and an expansionist and revanchist policy driven by Vladimir Putin. In the eyes of the United States, the leader of the Russian Federation seeks to take advantage of NATO, putting members of that alliance at risk. Not only that, but they completely disbelieve the arguments presented by the Kremlin's top official, claiming that these are excuses to justify an unprecedented act of aggression, like the one we will see next. An impressive ambush carried out by Russian troops who were stationed in the Zaporizhia region. The combination of images captured by drone and body searches gives us a complete perspective of the power that Russia is capable of projecting on its Western neighbor. Beyond the constant assistance of the Western powers, Ukraine is in serious trouble. Every day that passes, he is one step closer to defeat, and his rival is a wild but patient dog, capable of licking his wounds until he finds the right moment to kill his prey. Another problem is that the presidents of NATO member nations can express their anger at Putin's actions. But the truth is that Ukraine is not part of that pact at the moment. Therefore, the aggression against that country is not a concrete reason for the Atlantic Alliance to take direct measures against Russia. That is why international aid has been limited to monetary donations, weapons, intelligence exchange, and recently, the sending of some M1 Abrams tanks by the Biden administration. Many have criticized the time it took for the Western powers to collaborate with Zelensky, but the assistance finally materialized. Beyond this, it is necessary to keep in mind that war is a constantly changing panorama and that lukewarm collaboration could turn into direct military support at any time. Meanwhile, Russian tanks continue to crush local militants, as seen in this shocking video. The sound of the weapons is shocking. Imagine being in the place of the Ukrainian soldiers who must flee from this beastly power. For months, these types of images have populated the media. But what can we learn about the future of geopolitics from the potential Russian victory in Ukraine? The world is moving towards a multipolar vision where several powers have a gigantic importance in military and economic decisions. In this context, Russia and China are proposed as the axes of a new world order, both for their gigantic productive capacity and for the growth of their armies. In many ways, they are the counterweight to the influence of the United States and NATO. The interesting thing is that, since the beginning of the invasion, China has limited its support to the political and economic, maintaining trade agreements and becoming the main client for the services and resources offered by Moscow. This is important since it has allowed Putin to maintain his nation with incredible growth figures despite being in a painful war. Now, let's imagine that China decides to openly collaborate with war operations. What does Xi Jinping's government have to contribute to this bloody chess game? The Chinese armed forces have more than 2 million people in service, divided between the various wings that make up the army of that nation. Added to that impressive number is another 500,000 reservists ready to go into action and collaborate with a military effort in any corner of the planet. The most important thing when reflecting on the capabilities of the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, is to keep in mind that for 20 years they have been in a constant process of modernization. In 2024, it has the largest navy in terms of number of boats, and there are plans for the commissioning of new aircraft carriers and missile boats that will expand the force's area of action. Not only that, but the PLA has commissioned a series of new units aimed at electronic warfare, espionage, cybersecurity, and the military use of space. In that sense, China can provide endless resources to the already powerful military complex of the Russian Federation. Imagine the endless fleets of Kremlin battle tanks receiving daily and updated information from the satellites and other spy systems that Beijing has put into service. Again, let us return to the images captured by a Russian tank repelling an ambush in Crimea. The tree felled by a hail of .22 caliber bullets, one of the Kremlin's favorite weapons. For now, Moscow does not seem to need help, but if NATO member nations join directly, it will have to turn to all its partners. In that case, Xi Jinping could be a key ally, providing his Russian colleague with a large number of missiles, a necessary, expensive, and difficult to produce good. Although Russia is far from running out of war material, a notable fact is that in 2023 bilateral treaties were made with North Korea so that Putin's troops would have access to Kim Jong-un's missiles. In exchange, Moscow will provide concrete technological assistance to develop that nation's satellite program. Putin is evidently preparing for the future so that a large-scale war does not surprise him with a shortage of weapons. Given this, China is in the position to provide more platforms with better quality and performance than those offered by Kim Jong-un's industry. This would put the Ukrainian defensive strategy in jeopardy. Within weeks, all cities would be devastated or would have to surrender to the invading force. But there is another consequence that could arise from this, and it involves the permits and conditions that Washington imposed when handing over weapons to Vladimir Zelensky. It is time to pass the baton to the Americans. For 2 years, the United States has delivered to Ukraine air defense systems and missile launchers, such as the M142 HIMARS, MGM-140 ATAC-MS, and guided munitions. This, with the unbreakable rule that they were used within Ukrainian soil to shoot down invading elements. It is not a random condition. It has to do with the concern in NATO that an American missile crossing the border with Russia could be taken by the Kremlin as an incitement to raise the bar in the conflict, and worse still, putting nuclear weapons on the table. That is why, as of the time of this video's publication, the Biden administration has made it clear that medium and long-range missiles should only be fired at targets inside Ukraine. Now, let's suppose that Washington changes its mind and finally decides that limiting the use of such platforms is a death sentence for its small European ally. This opens the door to many unknowns that concern the entire planet. Russia's reaction to an eventual launch beyond its borders is a mystery. Faced with the possibility, although Russia is far from running out of war material, a notable fact is that in 2023 bilateral treaties were made with North Korea so that Putin's troops would have access to Kim Jong-un's missiles. In exchange, Moscow will provide concrete technological assistance to develop that nation's satellite program.
But what China is doing, or what some of its enterprises are doing, is to provide critical components for Russia's defense industrial base. Things like machine tools, microelectronics, and optics. Those are being used to help Russia on what's an extraordinary crash course effort to make more munitions, tanks, armored vehicles, missiles.
Now, suppose China not only provides large missiles, but also contributes the cheapest, but at the same time most valuable resource in any conflict: humans. With more than 2 million troops in service, Xi Jinping can afford to send hundreds of thousands of well-trained men to carry out missions alongside the Kremlin soldiers. This would be absolutely devastating for Ukraine. The Zelensky government has pursued all kinds of policies to encourage voluntary entry into the forces, while constantly increasing the forced selection of soldiers. But everything has a limit. With a population of less than 40 million citizens, there is a limit to the number of people between 18 and 60 years old that can be sent to the front lines. Although there are no reliable official figures, it is estimated that, between dead and wounded, Ukraine has lost 250,000 combatants. If China were to join the carnage, the only way Kyiv could hold on is with the arrival of NATO soldiers, or in other words, Washington's boys. Sending its troops to Europe would be the final step towards a direct and brutal conflict. The nuclear fears of the Cold War would finally be realized in an unexpected context in the heart of Europe. Of course, with the arrival of American soldiers, several things would change. First, Zelensky's government would no longer be in charge of operations. While many of its decisions are currently likely to be dictated by Western advice, in the event of a direct fight, it would be Washington that would have the final say on any operation. After all, it would be they who would provide the weapons and the people who would fire them. As to what we could expect from an event of that scale, it is a mystery. There could be massive nuclear attacks that would undoubtedly be a risk to the world's population. The deployment of fighter planes to try to conquer the airspace cannot be ruled out either, which would give a brutal advantage to whoever succeeds. The scope of the measures would depend on the desire for victory and how far each country would be willing to go. Let's listen to China's Minister of International Relations, Qin Gang.
如果美方不踩刹车，继续沿着错误的道路狂飙下去，再多的护栏也挡不住脱轨翻车，陷入对抗冲突。
Modern warfare is a complex game in which moving one piece can disrupt others. You see how the delivery of Chinese missiles could trigger a more direct involvement of Uncle Sam and consequently raise the violence of the conflict to dangerous limits, the likes of which we have only seen in apocalyptic movies. But how close are we to that? There are some important precedents to consider. On June 13, 2024, during the G7 meetings, Joe Biden and Vladimir Zelensky signed a bilateral security treaty that proposes joint work for a decade to improve Ukraine's military level and prepare the country for possible entry into NATO. The document proposes a future commitment by the United States to support the defense and concrete capabilities of Zelensky's army. At the same time, the meeting of countries also proposed a loan of $50 billion for Ukraine, money that will largely come from the frozen accounts of Russian companies. According to Joe Biden himself, the message that the G7 sent to Vladimir Putin is that the world will remain united to resist his attacks. Let's listen to part of the speech of the American president during the event.
Another reminder to Putin, we're not backing down. In fact, we're standing together against this illegal aggression.
The question is whether this bilateral treaty is a first step towards direct intervention and constant collaboration, or if it is just a show of discursive support. What makes the future of this union even more doubtful are the upcoming presidential elections in the United States. It is important to bear in mind that Donald Trump has declared that, if elected, the war in Ukraine would end the next day. He has also said that support for Kyiv should come mostly from European nations and not from Washington's coffers. So his position would be one of peace for economic convenience. The fear is that a new administration will completely ignore the objectives of these documents, and military assistance will cease, leaving Zelensky's men at the mercy of a painful defeat against Moscow's troops. The last thing left to analyze in this possible scenario of cross-confrontations is the relationship between the United States and China. Contrary to what is assumed, both nations are strongly connected and there are numerous businesses and treaties that intertwine their industries.
美国的对华认知和定位出现了严重的偏差，把中国当作最主要的竞争对手和最严峻的地缘政治挑战。这第一颗纽扣扣错了，就导致美国的对华政策完全偏离了。
To put these two powers' productive muscles into perspective, if we combine both nations, they represent 45% of global production of goods, services, and trade. A problem between the two would be much more than a rivalry, but would affect all the countries on the planet that in some way depend on that machinery. If the war in Ukraine were to end right now, in July 2024, regardless of who plants the flag in Kyiv, we can say that the biggest beneficiary would be China. Over the past 2 years, it was able to position itself not only as the world's leading economy, but it completely transformed its relationship with Russia. Now it is no longer the silent and obedient ally of the South, but rather a partner that imposes its own rules and has the cards to demand greater profits in its commercial exchanges. The surprising thing is that it achieved this without firing a single bullet, and even more incredible is that it did not completely tarnish its image, since in many instances Xi Jinping positioned himself as a dialoguer who longed for peace and tranquility. Given what the Asian giant has gained, it is difficult to imagine that it will put everything on the line by entering the war directly, putting at risk not only its current position in the world, but also the modernization it has carried out with its troops. Remember that for China, control over the South China Sea and Taiwan are absolute priorities, much more than a European dispute over old Soviet territories. In any case, if Xi Jinping decides to attack the entire Western order, it will be for these reasons, and not for the interests of his Russian partner. Only time will tell what the result of this unprecedented tension between the three most powerful countries on the planet will be. This way, we come to the end of the video. If you like this type of material in which we analyze the geopolitical context and the hypothetical outcomes of wars between powers, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military Force. Thank you for joining us.